The spark for this research really ignited when we managed to sequence the first ancient human genome. It required 6 years. It demanded the leading geneticists across the globe, and it necessitated 400 skeletons to solve this complex riddle. We finally decoded the Viking genome, and the outcomes they are unsettling. The DNA confirms that our established picture of the Viking world is entirely a fiction. But the revelations go deeper. There is a trace DNA present within these samples that indicates a forgotten link to the East. The Viking era, it's clear, was defined by a profound curiosity about the world. We are now set to reveal the findings on a genetic puzzle suggesting the Vikings were either the first genuine global citizens or the first global deceivers. So here's the reality. We have all seen the films. You know the archetype, the man with the flowing blonde hair, light eyes, perhaps a horned helmet, appearing as though he recently left a modern gym in Sweden. That is the visual identity we have been presented with for centuries. It's on our television series, in our comic books, and even sponsoring our athletic teams. Yet, science has just delivered a massive surprise to that entire concept. A vast team of scientists recently completed a 6-year investigation. This was no minor weekend assignment. This was an exhaustive study. They sequenced the genomes of over 400 Viking skeletal remains. These remnants were scattered across Europe and Greenland. They sought to uncover the truth about the population that raided the coastlines from the year 800 to 1050. And consider this, the findings were published in the esteemed journal Nature. So, this is definitely legitimate. They began with a woman named Kata. Her skeleton was discovered at a Viking burial site in Varnum, Sweden. Now, typically, when you unearth a Viking in Sweden, you expect Viking DNA, but once they processed the sequence on Kata and on hundreds of others, the resulting data contradicted the narrative. The first major shock, the hair. Everyone presumes Vikings were blonde. It's the classic portrayal, the Scandinavian standard. But the genetic breakdown revealed that many of these Vikings actually possessed dark hair. They bore little resemblance to the Nordic deities we witness in Hollywood. They looked distinct. They appeared swarthier. They seemed more varied. But hair pigmentation is merely the beginning. The study's lead, Professor Esker Willerslev, stated that genetically, the Viking world was fundamentally misunderstood. We hold this picture of a homogeneous group of Scandinavians, all related, setting out on joint raids. We imagine them as a particular lineage of people, a warrior elite. The DNA asserts the opposite. The research showed that Vikings were intermingling with local populations far more extensively than anyone had acknowledged. They had a much richer genetic background. It wasn't just individuals from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden keeping solely to themselves. It was a true mixing bowl. Here is where the findings become astonishing. The researchers uncovered genetic influences from southern Europe. They even detected genetic markers from Asia. And the most startling detail: this outside DNA wasn't merely present because Vikings brought people back as captives. This DNA was already there. The gene flow from the south and the east occurred before the Viking Age had truly commenced. This fundamentally dismantles the notion of the pure Scandinavian Viking. It radically alters the perception of what a Viking actually constituted. No one could have foreseen that significant genetic currents were entering Scandinavia from thousands of miles away back then. Pause on that thought for a moment. We are discussing an era before airplanes, before railways, before simple transit. Yet somehow genes from Asia were integrating into the Viking lineage. It signifies that the world was far more interconnected than we often recognize. It suggests that Scandinavia wasn't this secluded, icy wilderness of pure warriors. It was a crossroads. It was a passage point. But why is this important? Because it redefines the term Viking. It demonstrates that Viking wasn't a genetic label. It wasn't determined by your lineage. It was about your task. It was a vocation. And if it's a vocation, that means anyone could enlist. This unlocks a significant debate regarding their societal structure. If they weren't a single, unified race, how did they maintain such organization? How did they conquer nearly half the known world if they were a mixture of Southern Europeans, Asians, and Scandinavians? The answer might reside in their social organization. They were meritocratic. If you could fight, you were accepted. The DNA is undeniable. It showcases a society that was considerably more accepting of outsiders than we had previously envisioned. But it also prompts a troubling question. If they were intermixing so much, why do we have this persistent memory of them being blonde and blue-eyed? Is it plausible that the blonde Viking was actually the smaller group, the governing class, or perhaps just a narrative we created later to make them appear more divine? The research also implies that the different regions of Scandinavia were geographically distinct. We always lump them together, the Vikings. But the DNA confirms that Vikings from Norway weren't intermingling with Vikings from Sweden. They were rivals. They were separate populations. This means the Viking Age wasn't one massive invasion. It was a series of distinct, uncoordinated assaults from different genetic groups who simply happened to employ similar maritime technology. It's like discovering that the different crime families in New York weren't actually collaborating. They were just utilizing the same criminal tactics. But if the Swedish Vikings weren't mixing with the Norwegians, then who were their partners? This is where the Asian DNA serves as the definitive evidence. The Swedish Vikings were traveling east. They were navigating the rivers of Russia. They were encountering the merchants of the Silk Road, and they brought something substantial back. Not just silver, not merely silk, but they brought back genes. But wait until you hear about the imposters unearthed in Scotland. The transformation of the Picts into the pirates. Okay, let's delve deep into this Scottish puzzle, because this is where the notion of them being not entirely human starts to hold cultural weight, not in a science fiction sense, but in a cultural one. The concept of Viking was a contagion, and it was rapidly spreading. We consistently assumed Viking was something you were inherently born as. You were born in Norway, thus you were a Viking. Seems simple, right? It isn't that straightforward, however. The researchers analyzed two particular skeletons found in Orkney, Scotland. These individuals were interred with respect. They had Viking swords. They were laid to rest in a manner that clearly announced, warrior of the North. They were buried in the boat style, a classic Viking custom intended to transport the soul to Valhalla. For decades, archaeologists examined them and declared, yes, these are invaders from Scandinavia, but the DNA results were returned, and they showed a 0% genetic connection to Scandinavia, 0. These men were natives. They were genetically similar to contemporary Irish and Scottish people. They might have even been Picts, the enigmatic painted people of ancient Scotland. Yet, they lived and died as Vikings. This compels a huge realization. Viking wasn't an ethnicity, it was a brand name. It is akin to seeing someone today wearing a baseball cap. It doesn't mean they play the sport. It doesn't even mean they hail from the associated city. It simply signifies that they adhere to the group's philosophy. Professor S.D. Ren Sin-Baktin, an archaeologist from Denmark who participated in the study, said that the Viking identity was not restricted to people with Scandinavian lineage. These Scottish locals witnessed the Vikings' arrival. They recognized the might. They saw the advanced tools and concluded, I want to be part of that. They adopted the way of life. They embraced the beliefs. They probably spoke the language and utilized the weaponry. But genetically, they were entirely dissimilar. This completely reverses the narrative concerning the history of the British Isles. We typically view it as Vikings versus locals, the attackers against the defenders, but this evidence points to a much more dynamic situation. The locals were joining the attackers. They were essentially becoming them. It suggests that the Viking phenomenon was a socio-political movement, not solely a genetic incursion. They exported concepts. They exported expertise. And clearly, they exported a brand that was so appealing, even their adversaries desired membership. But while the natives in Scotland were mimicking Vikings, in the south of England, the situation was turning brutal. This brings us to the headless men of Dorset. In Dorset in the United Kingdom, archaeologists located a massive burial site. Now, mass graves are never pleasant news, but this one was uniquely grim. It contained around 50 skeletons. But a crucial component was missing, all of their heads. This was a systematic execution. These weren't soldiers who perished amid the fury of combat. The angle of the cuts on the neck bones suggests they were detained, bound, and executed one by one. They were systematically dispatched. Some of the remains from this location were used in this enormous DNA investigation, and what they discovered adds a heartbreaking dimension to the narrative. These men were Vikings. The DNA confirms it. But they weren't just random raiders, they were a cohesive unit. They were likely a raiding party that was intercepted by the locals, probably the Anglo-Saxons, and they paid the ultimate cost. It depicts a savage image of the Viking Age. We often romanticize the raids. We imagine them setting fire to villages and seizing treasure. But here we see the reverse side of the story. We see an operation that failed. We see 50 men, likely kin and shipmates, lined up and slaughtered hundreds of miles from their homes. But here is the most astonishing element. The DNA from these headless men showed that they all originated from various locations in Scandinavia. They were not a single family group. They were a professionally recruited crew. This supports the notion that Viking crews operated like mercenary ships. You enlisted the most capable men you could find, irrespective of precisely which village they originated from, as long as they were in your general territory. This also connects to a major historical hypothesis, known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. In the year 1002, the English king, Thard the Unready, ordered the extermination of all Danes in England. Was this mass grave the outcome of that directive? The DNA suggests the timeline is consistent. But reflect on the diversity once more. If these crews were recruiting from far and wide and locals were integrating, the Viking force was essentially the foreign legion of the Dark Ages. It was a diverse force of destruction, and this diversity might clarify their great success. They weren't constrained by a single approach. They adapted, they assimilated. If they encountered a culture with superior swords, they adopted the swords. If they met a culture with better maps, they utilized the maps. And if they met a culture with more robust genes, they incorporated the genes. This brings us to the Eastern Front. While the Danes were being beheaded in England, the Swedes were engaged in a fundamentally different activity in Russia. They were building an empire that would eventually give rise to one of the most incredible theories in history. Did the Vikings actually become the bodyguards of the emperor? Did Vikings encounter the Mongols? So we established that Vikings were not a single unified collective. The Danes headed west, the Norwegians went northwest, but the Swedes journeyed east. And this is where the Asian DNA connection truly begins to illuminate. The study demonstrated that the Swedish Vikings had a completely different genetic path. They weren't just raiding, they were trading. They sailed their longships across the Baltic Sea and accessed the massive river systems of what are now Russia and Ukraine. They descended the Dnieper. They descended the Volga. They named themselves the Rus. Does that name sound familiar? It should. It is the origin of the word Russia. That's correct. The DNA suggests that the founders of the Russian state were indeed Vikings. But here is where the astonishing theory emerges. How far east did they travel? We know they reached Constantinople. We know they reached Baghdad. There are Viking runes etched into the Hagia Sophia in Turkey, literally vandalism that reads, Halfdan was here, but the genetic markers from Asia found in the skeletons suggest they might have traveled even further, or that someone came to them. Imagine the Silk Road. It was the ancient world's superhighway. Spices, silk, and people moving from China to Europe. The Vikings situated themselves directly at the terminus of that routing. The research identified Asian genes in Viking Age Scandinavia. This suggests that merchants from the east, perhaps nomadic peoples from the steppes, potentially ancestors of the Mongols, were traveling up those massive rivers and intermingling with the Vikings. This paints a striking picture of a Viking warrior standing in a market in Kiev, exchanging furs for Arab silver, and alongside him, a trader from Central Asia. This fusion of bloodlines might provide a clue about the berserker fury. Okay, this concept is a little speculative, but hear me out. There exists a theory that the notorious berserker rage, where Vikings entered a trance, like frenzy and seemingly felt no pain, wasn't exclusively due to consuming psychotropic substances. Some researchers theorize it could have been a physiological trait, a distinct mutation. And where do unique genetic characteristics often emerge? Hybridization. When two disparate populations blend, like the robust Scandinavians and the resilient peoples of the Asian steppe, you sometimes observe hybrid vigor. You gain novel traits. Could the legendary power and fortitude of the Vikings be the direct outcome of this not entirely human DNA combination? It is a possibility that the current genetic data is merely beginning to hint at. And let's discuss the Varangian Guard. In Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor distrusted his own countrymen to serve as his protection. He required fighters who were loyal only to financial reward and had no local political ties. Consequently, he hired Vikings. These were the Varangian Guard, the ultimate elite. They wielded enormous axes. They were imposing figures and they were genetically highly varied. If you were a Viking serving in the Varangian Guard, you were residing in the focal point of the ancient world. You were mixing with Greeks, Turks, Africans, and Asians. And then, once your tour of duty concluded, you journeyed back home to Sweden and brought your new family with you. This sufficiently explains why the study found Southern European DNA in Scandinavia. It wasn't an invasion from the south, it was the Vikings escorting the south home. They were essentially importing the world to the north. But this creates a major puzzle. If they were so welcoming to the outside world, why did their culture ultimately fade away? The DNA study shows that this massive influx of external genes occurred before and throughout the peak of the Viking Age. But then, the movement suddenly ceased. Around the year 1050, the genetic door abruptly closed. The mixing stopped, the Vikings vanished, and the contemporary Scandinavian nations started to form, but before their final disappearance, they embarked on an endeavor that remains the subject of history's largest controversy. They looked west, even further west than England, further west than Iceland. They gazed upon the Atlantic Ocean and decided to make the perilous crossing, and this is where the theories become truly fantastic. Did they leave their DNA in the Americas 5 centuries prior to Columbus? The answer might be concealed within a contentious stone discovered in Minnesota. We know they successfully reached Newfoundland. We have the confirmed archaeological site at Ellan's Ox Meadows. That is a concrete fact. However, many people believe that was merely a staging area, a brief stopover. The bold hypothesis is that they ventured much, much farther inland. There are narratives, legends, really, about light-skinned gods or bearded men arriving in the Americas long before the Spanish conquest. For decades, these accounts were simply discounted as folklore. But now that we understand the Vikings were genetically diverse and carried Asian DNA, it prompts us to reconsider their navigational capabilities. How did they effectively traverse the open sea? They did not possess magnetic compasses. One widely accepted theory involves the sunstone, a crystal that could pinpoint the sun's location, even on overcast days, by leveraging polarized light. It sounds like a piece of magic or some form of advanced technology. Some individuals even propose it borders on ancient extraterrestrial engineering. But let's remain grounded for a moment. If they had this technology, and they possessed this varied genetic background that made them highly adaptable, is it possible they sailed down the American coast? There is a highly debated artifact known as the Kensington Runestone, discovered in Minnesota. It purportedly recounts the journey of Swedish and Norwegian Vikings deep into North America in the year 1362. Most established historians dismiss it as a fabrication, a pious fraud. But with this recent DNA evidence demonstrating the true extent of Viking travel and intermingling, some researchers are giving it renewed attention. If Vikings from Sweden could transport Asian DNA back to their homeland, could Vikings from Norway have deposited European DNA within Native American populations? Thus far, the large-scale DNA projects have not detected a Viking gene in pre-Columbian Native Americans. But the absence of proof is not proof of absence. We might simply be searching in the wrong location. Or perhaps the gene flow went in the reverse direction. Imagine a Viking ship returning from Vinland, not laden with gold but with people. If they brought Native Americans back to Iceland or Norway, their DNA would have been assimilated into the local populace. There is actually a unique genetic marker found in Iceland called the Siwani lineage. It is a mitochondrial DNA type. It is typically found in Native Americans and Asians, and it is present in a few Icelandic families. How precisely did it arrive there? The standard explanation involves recent immigration or Asian ancestry, but the chronological data suggests its arrival occurred centuries ago. Could this evidence be the conclusive proof? Did a Viking male transport a Native American woman back to Iceland around the year 1000? It remains the most logical explanation that aligns with the extraordinary Viking narrative. And then there is the Amazon conjecture. This is arguably the most outlandish of all the propositions. Some researchers draw attention to ancient artwork in South America depicting bearded men. Vikings certainly had beards. It is admittedly a tenuous connection, but consider the Amazon River. We know the Vikings were unparalleled masters of river navigation. They effectively controlled Russia via its waterways. Why couldn't they navigate the Amazon? It seems improbable, but remember, we just discovered they carried Asian genes even before the term Viking existed. We just learned that Scots transformed into Vikings. We just found out they were genetically disparate groups operating under a single banner. If they could reach Baghdad, what makes the Amazon so far-fetched? But let's transition to something even more enigmatic: their mythology. Norse mythology is filled with conflicts between two pantheons of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir. The Aesir were the deities of conflict, Odin, Thor. The Vanir were the gods of fertility and nature, Freyja, Freyr. For years, historians considered this just a fable. But what if it represents a cultural recollection of a genetic event? What if the Vanir were the original inhabitants of Scandinavia, the ones carrying southern European DNA, and the Aesir were the newcomers, the ones with the DNA from the Asian steppe? The war between the Aesir and Vanir concludes with them mixing saliva to create a new entity, a truce, a blending of blood. This aligns with the DNA study almost perfectly. The Viking genome is the direct outcome of these distinct groups colliding and subsequently merging. The mythology is not simply fiction, it is a genetic history. It means that when you engage with the tales of Thor, you aren't reading about a divine being. You are reading about a genetic assimilation. But inevitably the era had to conclude. The study points out that the gene flow abruptly halted, the diverse, multicultural realm of the Vikings solidified into the modern nations of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Why did this occur? Perhaps the church imposed restrictions on the importation of people. Perhaps the national boundary solidified, or maybe the Viking impulse simply exhausted itself. But the DNA did not vanish, it merely became concealed. And that leads us to the final and perhaps most intimate question: the modern Viking paradox. So, let's bring this discussion to a close. What does all this research mean for us today? The scientists didn't only analyze ancient remains, they compared the ancient DNA to contemporary people. They sought to determine how much of that Viking bloodline persisted through a millennium of history. The figures are quite striking. If you reside in the United Kingdom today, there is a strong likelihood that you are partly Viking. The study estimates that up to 60% of the population in the UK carries significant Viking DNA. That translates to millions of individuals walking around with the genetic code of a raider within their cells. You might be a financial planner, an educator, or a health worker, but deep down, your cells recollect the North Sea. But in Sweden, the proportion is even greater, 10%. Now, you might think only 10%. I presume Swedes were 100% Viking. That is precisely the central revelation. Modern-day Scandinavians are, in fact, genetically distinct from their Viking forebears. The gene pool has undergone significant transformation over the last 1,000 years. The specific Viking markers, those unique combinations of Scandinavian, Southern European, and Asian genes, have either diminished or changed form. Professor Willislev summarized it perfectly. The history books will require revision. We cannot look at a modern Swedish person and assert that this is precisely what a Viking looked like. Evolution, migration, and the passage of time have blurred these ancestral distinctions. This study also decisively dismantles the concept of pure ancestry that some fringe groups attempt to claim. There are individuals who fixate on Viking heritage as a symbol of racial purity, but science has just demonstrated that the Vikings were the very opposite of pure. They were the quintessential mixed bloods of the medieval period. They were a composite of everything they encountered. They succeeded precisely because they were diverse. They absorbed people. They absorbed cultures. They absorbed DNA. Consider those two skeletons in Orkney again, the locals who chose to become Vikings. That is the true legacy. It wasn't about blood. It was about the mentality. It was about the advanced shipbuilding technology. It was about the socio-political structure. The Viking was a global phenomenon that swept across the world, and it was entirely indifferent to your genetic background. If you could competently wield a sword and handle an oar, you were accepted. This research also highlights the astonishing scope of their movement. We mentioned Leif Erikson being the first European in North America. The DNA reinforces this inquisitive spirit. They migrated from what is now Denmark to England, from Norway to Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, and Greenland, and from Sweden to the Baltics. They were, in essence, the information highway of the Dark Ages. They fundamentally connected the known world. But there is one final, crucial twist. The study indicates that after the Viking Age concluded around the year 1050, something remarkable happened to the genetic flow. It stopped, just as swiftly as it began. The massive inflow of foreign genes into Scandinavia suddenly ceased. The genetic floodgates were shut tight. The intermingling slowed significantly, and the boundaries, both physical and genetic, became strictly closed. Why? What was powerful enough to stop the most mobile people on Earth? Perhaps it was the Christian cross supplanting the pagan hammer. The proliferation of Christianity introduced new regulations, frowning upon the brutal slave trade and the raiding culture that had fueled this genetic melting pot. Perhaps it was the emergence of powerful, centralized kingdoms. Jarls evolved into kings, and open frontiers transformed into defended borders. The wild, freely roaming, multiracial world of the Vikings came to a definitive end. The word Viking ceased to be a job title, a thing you did, and became a memory, a legend to be chronicled by the monks who despised them. But here is the enduring truth about the past. It is never truly obliterated. Those skeletal remains in the earth, they recount every detail. They remember the savage reality that the sagas often ignore. They remember the execution sites of the headless men in Dorset, men who traveled thousands of miles only to perish in the mud. They remember the woman named Carter in Sweden, buried with high honors, who was not genetically Scandinavian at all. They remember the Scottish converts who picked up a sword and adopted the Viking existence because it offered a better living than agriculture. And perhaps most provocatively, they remember the strange, faint traces of Asian genes that journeyed all the way from the Silk Road to the icy shores of Norway. We are only beginning to comprehend the vast amount of information that DNA can disclose. Science is effectively rewriting the history books, line by line. Every time we sequence a genome from an ancient grave, we uncover a new enigma. We find that humans have always been travelers, innovators, and blenders. We do not remain static. This study thoroughly shatters the 19th century romanticized image of the Viking. It proves that the Vikings were not a separate elite group. They weren't entirely human in the sense that they were some isolated, flawless, blonde-haired tribe protected from the rest of the world. They were something far more tangible than that. They were a mess. They were a chaotic, brutal, adventurous, intermingling mess of genes and cultures. They acted as a sponge that absorbed DNA from every place they raided, traded, and established settlements. And honestly, that is what makes their history so captivating. They are a reflection of ourselves. They embody the turbulent nature of human history. So, the next time you encounter a Viking in a film, a television series, or a video game, remember this crucial study. Don't simply focus on the battle axes and the longships. Examine them more closely. Remember that beneath that iron helmet, the hair might be dark brown, not golden. Flowing through those veins might be genetic material from the sunny Mediterranean or the steppes of Russia. That warrior bellowing a battle cry might actually be a local Scotsman imitating a conqueror. In a landmark genetic study published by Nature, researchers from the University of Copenhagen, led by Professor Esk Willerslev, declared that the traditional image of the blonde, blue-eyed Viking warrior is a fantasy. The 6-year project, which sequenced over 400 Viking genomes, confirmed that these raiders and traders were not a pure, single race. Instead, they were a genetically diverse, multicultural population with significant gene flow from southern Europe and Asia. Even before the Viking Age began, crucially, the DNA revealed that Viking was a job title, not an ethnicity, a finding that officially redefines the history of medieval Scandinavia and the British Isles. So, what are your thoughts? Does the revelation that Vikings were a multicultural genetic tapestry diminish the fantasy for you? Or does it render them even more formidable as a global force? And seriously, do you believe the Vanir versus